Welcome everybody. This will be the final Q community update for 2024. It's been a busy year, and so look to sort of give you some updates on where we are with things in the Q open source project. We're going to a fairly usual agenda here. I won't go through each of the items here, but we'll touch on them in turn as we get to each section. Excuse me. It's been almost exactly 2 months since our last call. That's linked from there. Since then, we've also had a team offsite, a very intense week where actually we sought to progress modules in the central registry, in particular curated modules, and what our plan is for those in the central registry. We'll talk about a bit more about that in later slides. But also just to remind people that we use release projects and roadmap projects in this way rather than things like milestones, in case anyone is unfamiliar with that. So without further ado, on to release updates. Daniel?
So since the last call a couple of months ago, we did do the final release for 0.11. There's many news in there. You can go read the release notes if you want every single detail, but here's the top level news. There's 2 new built-ins, match-in and match-if, which were mainly added for the sake of JSON schema. There's also lots of eval v3 work, and you can see the summaries of that in the performance thread that Marcel leaves updates on. We also have a new field ordering experiment that Matthew will talk about, I believe. And we also have many improvements to JSON schema, which Roger will talk about. So much of what you will hear in this call has already landed in this release, while some other stuff is only in master. And we do plan to do a backporting release for some fixes, but nothing so far has seemed super urgent, so maybe in like a couple of weeks. But if any of you see anything that needs to be backported, please let me know. And we're now starting the release cycle for 0.12, aiming roughly for February, just to give you an idea, but no strict deadline just yet.
Apologies, Daniel, you can control the slides. I accidentally clicked. Please go ahead.
No worries. And also a quick reminder, if any of you are stuck on old versions for any reason, such as performance or any regressions in terms of errors or behavior, or any breakage of APIs, or even breakage of the CLI, please let us know, because I am aware of some people that fall under some of those camps, and I'm already following up with those people. But if any others are, please let me know, and we want to be aware of those.
Cool. I think we're now on to the evaluator. Marcel or Matthew, over to you.
Yes. So just to recap, we're rewriting the core evaluator of Q. And the goal there is to significantly improve performance, both the simplicity of the evaluator internally and maintainability. So we've redesigned a lot of the algorithms to be significantly easier, which is still complex. Think of it as like a garbage collector, right? But it's significantly better. And also to make it available in the API or CLI as an experiment, so it's already there. So thank you again for a lot of people that have filed bugs for this. This has been really useful in improving. So since the last time, so we had 44 issues that were closed, so now it's 61. So there's a few more open. Some of them are quite esoteric, so really only not popping up in the evaluator, some of them, but really only in the tooling, for instance. And also the rate of closing is now faster than the rate of opening, so that looks good. So we focused on getting Unity, fully compliant, and also JSON schema. JSON schema, so some of the work that Roger will talk about later, exposed a lot of intricacies of the evaluator, which has been really helpful to improving v3 as well. So those are the 2 focuses. So again, right, like if you want to make sure that your project keeps working with the new evaluator, think about adding it to Unity, because that will give you a good head start. So we have a lot of fixes that are not submitted yet. I'll come back to that a bit later, why. So the important fixes since last time are some big O improvements, so time complexity improvements and some closeness issues. So what's remaining is some of the disjunction issues. So then another big improvement since last time is our field ordering and trim, or Matthew will tell you about what the status is there. So to give you a little bit more quantitative feedback here, so before most of the Unity projects had some problems here and there, or like not passing, quite frankly. So now we have 5 out of 15 remaining with errors or panic, so where it's really not compliant. So we need to do some brushing of the field ordering to really be able to compare them fully. So if we look at, for example, one of the problem cases with performance was TMM1 Texas.q. So there you saw that in V2, it's running in 10 seconds, the normal evaluation. So with V3, like last month, it was taking 30 seconds. So now it's taking 1 second. And just as a reminder, this is only with big O improvements. So we're still not doing any memory reuse. So that makes V3 considerably slower than V2. And we have not deliberately sort of implemented it, but not released fine-grained structure sharing yet. And the reason for that is that so structure sharing exposes bugs, but it also tends to paper over bugs. So while we're still sort of in the bug cleaning mode, it's better not to enable it yet. So that's why we have not done that yet. And also, quite frankly, it doesn't seem to be necessary quite yet. So for now, we're not enabling it just to be able to expose more bugs, really. So also the tests went to, so the test running for TMM1 went from many minutes in V2 to not finishing last month with V3 because it was taking too much memory, to running in 20 seconds now. So that's also a big improvement. And as I said, there's still lots of improvements to do in V3. So this is not the end of it yet. So last time I mentioned there are some bug fixes in V3 that were popping up in so relative to V2 that caused actually some projects in Unity or outside to fail. So we've presented how to correct these, but in the end, these failures were so common that we have a QDebug option open inline to basically mimic now the V2 behavior. So if you're running into this bug, you can basically add this, enable this flag to get the V2 behavior in V3. So there are some other things where V3 fixes closeness. It's not enabled by default yet. Maybe we should for the first release. I don't know, but maybe not. But there are basically some other closeness fixes that have been fixed since last month. Those are not covered by the open inline yet, but they're a bit more esoteric. So we'll see if people run into this problem. But again, so if you have closeness issues and it's a problem for you, and you see that it's a bug fix, but you think like this is really awkward to start using V3 without it. You're probably not the only one having this issue, so please let us know. Yes, so by this I hand it over to Matthew.
Cool, thank you. Hello, I'm Matthew. I've been around for sort of 5 months here now, but I've not actually spoken at one of these before. So a couple of things I've been working on. So to date, there has been no specification of the order of fields within a struct in any output that Q produces, whether through eval or export or any of the normal commands. And we want to fix that. So we have this experiment, which is landed as part of 0.11, which you can enable. And what we want is for you as users to be able to control the order of the fields in some sensible fashion without necessarily having to introduce explicit syntax and capabilities within the language in order to be able to control that. So this first implementation is what we're calling a topological ordering. And this will occur whenever it's possible, whenever it's not ambiguous. So in this little example here, if I've got some struct X, which has got fields in this order, GBC, and then some struct Y, and I unify them together, then we spot that the field C is in common between both of them. And so we can therefore say by a topological walk of all of the fields, we link them together with the C, and so we should get this output. Now, of course, doing this, you can end up in a situation where there is ambiguity. You can introduce cycles. There are all sorts of weird gotchas. And in a lot of the cases, we use heuristics to try and break those cycles or to act as tie breaks. And yeah, there are a bunch of cases where we fall back to a lexicographical ordering. But those scenarios tend to occur when there's something quite complicated going on. In normal circumstances, you should be able to see that the output of QEval, for example, now reflects the order of fields in the input as well. But this is an experiment at the moment, so there is an issue to track feedback on this. So if you try this and you find the behavior surprising, then please do let us know. We are aware that there are a couple of bugs currently. So yes, please have a play with that and let us know. It should, although again, we know that there are a couple of differences, it should apply equally to V2 and V3. So if you want to migrate to using V3, then a way of doing that might be to stick with V2, but turn on TopoSort. And so the semantics should be exactly the same. You will just see that some of the output fields are now in a different order. And then once you're comfortable with that, switch over to V3, keep TopoSort on, and you should see, essentially no substantial difference there in the order of the fields. So that is field ordering. The other thing I've been working on more recently is trim. So qtrim, I'm sure many of you know it, is a command that already exists, but it currently only works for V2 of the evaluator, and it also has some known bugs. The purpose of trim is to remove redundant conjuncts from your source, and we probably don't have time to get on to exactly what conjuncts mean, but sort of essentially think of them as the field values. And so if we have this example here, so we've just got a key greeting, we could say, well, this first line, the string, is redundant because wherever it occurs, we're going to find that the string literal hello is going to be more specific. And so it's safe to remove that first line. A more complicated example is this sort of thing, and this is where we've seen trim used very effectively. So, for example, with the Kubernetes tutorials. So here we have some data, and we've got a field which is repeated, age, and it's repeated in all of the elements of this field with the same value. And so here with the last line here, we're saying, well, every single element within this list has to obey this schema S, and the schema S specifies that age must always be 5. So therefore, the age 5 within the data, the list elements themselves, is completely redundant and can be removed. There's still some sort of debate and discussion as to exactly how we want to define the semantics of trim, but that's the general direction. It might end up being slightly more powerful than the current version of trim within V2, but at a minimum, we want to make it work with V3 and to solve the bugs that exist within V3. The perfect solution to this, so if you think about this in a sort of more abstract sense, really the goal here is to minimize the number of conjuncts without changing the semantics of your Q program itself. So before trim and after trim of your source, if you run it through QEval or QExport, you should get exactly the same result. So we're not altering any of the semantics there. So you could say, well, the perfect behavior is to minimize the total number of conjuncts in your source. That is not actually possible because it turns out to be equivalent to an NP-complete problem. So heuristics will apply here as well. So yes, there is discussion to be had as to which heuristics we want to apply there. That's it from me. Thank you.
Yes, and just a remark on the TopoSort. So the V2 approach approximates topological sort, but in a rather poor fashion. So this was really an effort to make that more principled. And also one of the ideas behind it is that, based on feedback and what we know from other configuration languages that don't do this and that do this, is that people tend to want to have schema order, but because values and schemas in Q are sort of, there's not a clear distinction between it. Actually, defining schema order is relatively tricky in Q. So topo sorts seem to be it's actually easier to do than a schema sort, strangely enough. So yeah, so that's an idea. Like we will do the topo sort first, and then we can see how that evolves. Paul?
Yeah, just briefly whilst we're on that, and maybe I'll just skip back a couple of slides quickly. Or sorry, animation. The one thing I guess, Matthew, is that in this, if people have good and or bad experience with topo sort, or indeed just ordering in general, we're looking for feedback and to hear about those situations, right? It's not, please just, and because I think particularly, and I forget who it was who raised a question about how can I control the orderings of, I think it was YAML output in some way, shape or form, if I'm remembering. Daniel's giving me a nod. All of this kind of stuff falls under that same sort of heading, even though it's not explicitly about topo. So what people are seeing and experiencing and needing in the wild is really what we want to hear about. And we can then work out where that sits. Is it part of topo sort or whatever? So please don't be shy about raising issues or suggestions as to how things could be done better. Sorry, Marcel, let me get back. Oh,
yeah.
Let me get, oh, couldn't. There we go.
Yeah, so for the evaluator, next step, just to summarize. So this is the same slide as last time, but I've crossed a few things out. So the goal is here to remove the remaining discrepancies in Unity. I think we're in, correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, but in a fairly good shape when it comes to V3 with JSON schema. Maybe there's still some outstanding things, but so really it's removing the remaining things for Unity. There's still some bugs, will still be some bugs out there, but the number of bug fixes relatively to V2 is far greater now than the outstanding bugs in V3. But we really want Unity to pass for the projects that are there, right? So so field ordering is crossed out because it's for at least a large part done now. It's not really a holdup for releasing it anymore, or at least very close. So the finer grained structure sharing is no longer a holdup for releasing, because what we've seen is with some of the big O improvements that we've done, it's already such a big improvement that the finer grained structure sharing doesn't really seem to be necessary anymore. We thought it would be a necessary thing to counteract the lack of memory reuse, but it seems that the big O approaches are good enough to improve the performance. There's, I think, one or two more big O improvements to go, and we hope that addresses all of it. If not, we might still reconsider fine-grained structure sharing. It's mostly there for to go already. But yes. Okay, well, that's good to know. Yes. So yeah, and just a reminder, V2 is no longer actively maintained, so please try V3 and give feedback if you can.
I will just say that the majority of people are likely to still be using V2, so we're aware of that. So when we see bug reports come in that correspond to V2, what we're actively doing is checking how does this behave in V3, encouraging people to try V3, verifying that things work in V3, and then on a sort of case-by-case basis, checking and assessing how viable is it for you, the bug reporter, to actually move to V3. And so we are no longer actively maintaining V2, but we're doing so in a sort of a careful way to making sure we actively try and say, please help us migrate to V3. It's a sort of quite a hand-holdy process there. Great. Okay, thanks, Marcel. Q with other languages. I'm just going to briefly include this slide from last time here. If anyone is interested in experimenting with Q from different languages, please let us know, especially if you're running into issues. We, I think, as I mentioned last time, have at least one user experimenting from the Rust side of things. So, yeah, please do give us a shout if we can help in any way there. Rog, on the Coding's JSON schema side.
Yeah, so I've been working on JSON schema improvements quite a bit. That's kind of core to what we're trying to do in the central registry, as well as other, it's also very, like, in general, lots of people define schemas in JSON schema, so it's very useful to import them into Q. So there's been a bunch of improvements since the last update, and we've had an external contributor, Hachishu, perhaps pronounced, who might be present today. It's been some great contributions there, so really, really useful. So many thanks to them. A few itemize a few of the changes. So there's a bunch of changes with respect to the specification. For example, we don't, in earlier versions, you weren't allowed to have keywords alongside $ref. There's improved handling of some regular expression oriented things. Much improved handling of arrays. That actually might really help a lot of people. I'll skim over this. Better format support, so we support the date format, some OpenAPI formats, specific formats in 32 and in 64. A much better implementation of unique items, which Marcel did with list.unique items. That also improves the standard library. The logic for enum and const when there are structs is also much better now, and actually doesn't allow extra fields, and doesn't define fields either. I can say next slide, but I can actually do it myself, can't I? There's another change which I thought might be worth going into slightly more detail. Is an improvement to the way closeness is treated. So here's an example JSON schema. I'm actually expressing this in Q rather than JSON because it's a more terse syntax that fits on the slide. But imagine this is JSON. So here we've got a schema which has which defines a struct, which has one field called foo and another field called bar, and the field called foo refers to a definition called foo, which is itself called foo and doesn't allow properties. So if you're not familiar with JSON schema, then this probably doesn't matter too much. But I think this is interesting. Previously, this is the actual Q equivalent of this. So you can see we've got an optional field called foo, which refers to a definition called hash foo. And one thing to notice from that previous example is that third line, additional properties false, which says no additional properties are needed. But here we can see that actually there's nothing stopping additional properties on that entire thing. So actually this is incorrect in this respect. So the new output looks like this. So essentially, we're closing up that outer thing, and we also have that redundant close inside hash foo, and it's redundant because we know, as we probably know, definitions close up everything inside them, and that can actually be fixed later. But essentially, we've decided that certainly as an initial approach, we're going to always add a close operator, and we're always going to add the ... when something's open. And that means that as a matter of principle, that means that we're going to be correct, because you can, in that previous example, you could say that like if that outer thing was not closed, then like currently we will add in the new implementation, we will add an ellipsis. We'll explicitly add an ellipsis. And you could say that if this is at package level, that's not necessary because packages are open by default. But then if you take that package and you put it into a definition, then you would be losing that openness. And so you'd actually be losing information. So you'd actually, so we've decided to basically make it so that you can always take JSON schema output and put it into a definition without breaking the schema. Now, as you can see there's some redundancy there. And we did have a change to remove the redundancy. The idea is that you can, for JSON schema at any rate, you can lexically look at where you have a close inside a definition and say, oh, that's actually redundant, and remove it. That didn't quite work, so we reverted it. So that will get better in future. But for now, the semantics are correct. It might not look perfect, but it will improve. and it's a lot better than it was. It fixed a bunch of bugs. Another thing that I'm working on right now is some improvements to the way references work in JSON schema. So references in JSON schema, as a sort of reminder, can refer to other schemas, and they can also have inside the URI. It can actually have a JSON pointer reference to arbitrary internal structure inside the JSON schema. And until now, we basically allowed essentially no references into internal structure, or where we did the references that we generated incorrect code, and we didn't support anchors either. And if there was a schema inside the current schema that declared its own ID, then we wouldn't allow access. We wouldn't allow references into that. So I've implemented a new approach which essentially regularizes all of this, and with a new approach internally, which is much more regular and takes a lot out of the load of the ad hoc approach. One thing that I will say is that by default, we won't allow the JSON schema, the queue that we generate will not include all the internal structure as a possibility for referencing, because essentially it's bad practice to do that anyway. That makes would make the JSON schema internal structure available as API inside Q, and I don't think we think that's generally not a great idea. And I mean, looking at for example JSONschema.org, the collection of schemas there, it's not done very often, and we think that in general it's bad practice. But this whole thing is going to be very configurable, so if you wish to allow that for your own custom schema generation, then you will be able to configure it so that it does allow that. And the way that it does that is we're adding 2 new fields to the configuration struct in the package, JSON schema package. And the first one is a function that is called anytime you have a reference. And so it's called with the ID of the schema that we're generating a reference for. And we also, if it's actually generated inside the current schema, then we include this root relative path inside that. And that returns a triple of, this is where you're going to refer to the import path, the Q import path. There's some path within that, and perhaps an error. So that actually allows you to do all kinds of, that's very flexible. It allows you to potentially map internal references into external references and vice versa. And this is important for some things. Sometimes we have JSON schemas that vendor things, but we actually want the internal definitions to become outside. So this defined schema is called for anything where we had an internal schema, but that's actually going to end up in some external package, and that allows the external driver to decide to put that somewhere else and define it somewhere else. So that's actually pretty close to landing. I've got all the external tests that we're passing, and a bunch more. So it fixes about 85 tests. And this is key. What we want. One of the things we want to do is import the JSON Kubernetes JSON schema into the central registry, and that's this is a key enabler for doing that. And in the not so distant future, we also plan to support generating JSON schema from Q. That's after all these changes.
So just to say, Rog, the key enabler for importing Kubernetes Open API specification, which is broadly speaking JSON schema, but just to clarify the source of truth there that we're referring to.
That's a good yes.
And then just to then close the loop on this, and we'll talk about this in a couple more slides as well. We're planning on publishing those core a module with those core APIs to the central registry, and this is being a means of then actually replacing the sort of the manual effort that people have to go to at the moment with Q-Get-Go, where they're based on the Go types. Cool. Okay, thanks, Rog. So now just onto the central registry. On modules themselves, that is like the design of modules, the implementation. There are no specific updates of note to mention since the last community call. That's a good thing, as in things are actually pretty stable there. The changes have been within things like the encodings, and within the implementation of the central registry itself. So moving on to the central registry, just as a quick reminder for those who may not have seen this before, the goal of the central registry is to act as a well-known place for well-known schemas for well-known services. And that really is just a means of saying that it's going to be a key enabler for the Q dependency management ecosystem. In much the same way that the Go module proxy is, or that Crates is for Rust, or that NPM is for the JavaScript/TypeScript ecosystem. So it's also a means of discovery and a means of sort of sharing things, especially public modules, but it's not limited to public modules, as we'll talk about in a second. It is domain name-based modules, and that is very similar to the Go approach, where if you can control a domain name or a part of a domain name namespace, you can publish Q modules to that. We only support github.com rooted modules for now, but we absolutely plan to extend that. And the authn and authdead is also derived from GitHub. Semantic version-based modules, very similar to Go. We support the publishing of native modules, but as Roger's also been talking about here and talked about previously, we also support publishing modules that have some sort of upstream, whether that be coming from schemastor.org or, as I said, the Open API specifications for the for the core Kubernetes APIs. Doesn't matter. We can produce a sort of and publish a derived artifact to the central registry. Central registry is live in alpha, and all you have to do is go to registry.q.works, and then all you should have to do is authenticate via GitHub. The Q command line natively supports interacting with the Q central registry, or indeed any other OCI registry, but by default, it contacts the central registry. We're continuing to work on early versions of documentation, so like package.go.dev and search and discovery. We've actually, since the last community call, actually been finessing some of the finer points around edge cases when it comes to things like transferring of whether it be organizations or repositories on the GitHub side of things, to just make sure we've got a really tight implementation of effectively the delegated authorization within the central registry. So now talking a bit more about the curated module side of things that Roger alluded to earlier on. With the central registry, one of the goals that we have is to have high quality curated schemas for well-known services. Now, ultimately, somebody like GitHub might actually choose to publish a version of the GitHub Actions workflow schema themselves. And that, quite frankly, is the best possible situation to be in. But GitHub actually don't publish a version of any sort of any schema for the GitHub Actions workflows. It's a community effort that is published to schemastor.org. But what we found is that rather than actually just depending on some ad hoc JSON schema that is not versioned, clearly, at least within Schemastor, it's better for us to publish a derived version of that to the central registry and depend on the Q schema that is derived from the upstream JSON schema. And that's exactly what we're doing there. So this initial list of curated modules that I've got here is those that we're targeting for the central registry that we will curate. GitHub, if you're listening and you wanted to take over the publishing of the GitHub Actions workflow schema, please let us know. Very happy for that. We won't hold that tightly at all. Very happy for someone to take over the mantle on that one. But as I've highlighted here on the GitHub Actions workflow, we are actually using that published modules in the Q repo itself as part of our GitHub Actions workflow declarations. And the plan is with all of these curated modules in this list that we will be dogfooding them heavily ourselves. So they're not either we're using it directly or we've got some sort of documentation that is fully tested that demonstrates these things actually in action. But, and we've had this question already, what about other schemas that you might actually be using that you want to see on this curated list? Please just let us know. We've derived this list here based on popularity from upstream sources and or popularity of the service to which they pertain. But we're absolutely open to sort of helping kickstart the well-supported list of modules that is published to the central registry, and so very open to any other suggestions that people might have. So here is just a very quick demonstration of some Q that is in the Q repo that is using the published GitHub Actions workflow schema. As you can see, we've just published it to a temporary namespace for now. That's so that we can sort of kick the tires a tiny bit more on the JSON schema encoding support, and that's what Raj talked about earlier on. but also getting a slightly better handle on what does that curated module namespace actually look like from our perspective when it comes to publishing these things. So even though it is just a temporary namespace for now, we are, as I outline on the next steps here, looking to publish to a non-experimental path and then commit to that path. Just to emphasize, however, there's absolutely no reason why somebody else couldn't publish another GitHub Actions workflow schema to a different path that they control, and that would be totally legitimate. Just as in the Go package ecosystem, there's no sort of fight over who controls a particular part of the namespace. It's very well defined. In this case, at least for now, it's based on, do you control a subpart of the GitHub namespace, whether through a username or organization. So we want to publish some docs around the use of curated schemas. I've actually got docs listed twice there. Apologies. No, I haven't. I beg your pardon. The third point there is actually around the published, the automatically generated documentation, an initial version of search and discovery, better authn integration with GitHub Actions. Just to briefly touch on this is to make sure that if you need to interact with the central registry in any way from, say, GitHub Actions workflows, although it's not limited to that, in fact, anything that supports OIDC Connect, that's the kind of thing we're looking to support via the central registry as well. And then just to give people line of sight to future things that we'll do with the central registry, full support for vanity domains. So for example, if you just own a domain and want to publish to that domain namespace, we will support that. We'll then alternative support for different authn and authz. Sorry, Broj.
I just thought we should mention, actually, with respect to that authorization, that we do actually currently, although we haven't announced it, and we will announce this soon, support auth tokens. So we actually have a facility now to generate auth tokens in the UI, and you can use that. So we use that, for example, in our CI to interact with the central registry. So that's a sort of alternative. That's a kind of poor man's GitHub Actions integration, but it does allow you to integrate with the central registry, to talk to authorize with the central registry without having to go through the OAuth flow in the cloud, for example. So that's super useful. But we haven't announced that, but we will announce that with examples.
That was very delicately done, Rog, and totally remiss of me to have missed it off the slides. So
we all forgot about it, but it's actually like it's actually like a key enabler, I think.
It is a key enabler, totally. And so we will. I think we can actually chuck together a fairly good example piece of documentation, on qlang.org to demonstrate that most clearly. Daniel's just included the commands and relevant URL in the chat, for those who want to get started with that. Briefly to talk about qlang.org, moving on to that and the docs and content side of things. Jonathan is actually away this week, and I have to do a mea culpa there, as in I hadn't remembered when Jonathan told me that he was going to be away, that it was also then going to coincide with the community update. So my apologies that we don't have a fuller update here. That one is with me. Just to remind on the focus of qlang.org, it is for newcomers of Q as well as experienced users of Q for various different use cases. And so if you feel like your requirements on qlang.org are not being met in whatever way, shape or form, please shout, whether it be sort of questions on Discord, Slack or GitHub issue or discussions. It's always incredibly valuable. And Jonathan looks to sort of then engage with those and understand more about where people are coming from. And Jonathan would have wanted me to share this in his absence. One of the key quality of life things for people who use the playground, and the playground is used a lot, we're aware of that, is the ability to format your Q code. That might seem like a small thing, but for people who are actually using it to share examples or reproduces or whatever, it's a relatively significant quality of life improvement, as small though it is. Moving on to the QLSP side of things. We have an initial version of the VS Code extension that has been published. This actually took quite a bit more sort of mechanics than I had anticipated. As you can see here, it is published under a slightly janky name, VS Code Q, but with the gracious support of somebody who actually has the Q name already, we do plan to flip this. So from a discoverability perspective, it won't be called VS Code Q, it will actually be called Q, much like the Go extension is called Go. And as well, we'll also be verified as a publisher, the open source Q project will be verified as an open source publisher after around 6 months of publishing this extension. This initial version of the extension supports Q version 0.11, which has the initial support for QLSP, as minimal as it is. The bulk of the changes will land in 0.12. We're very close on that. The delays on the extension side of things didn't help in us actually landing the changes to support for, go-to definition error diagnostics in 0.11. The NeoVim plugin is also working, and I'll be publishing a PR to the NVim LSP config repo, so that there's effectively like a effective 2 or 3 line configuration change, depending on how you configure NeoVim, in order to get things up and running. That's slightly less feature-rich, I should say, than the VS Code plugin, and that's sort of intentional. It's just reality that the majority of developers use VS Code, and so we will likely, and actually the support within VS Code for providing custom actions, more rich support for restarting or interacting with the LSP in some way. It's not to say we will ignore NeoVim, but it's likely that NeoVim and other editors will actually sort of follow soon after whatever changes that we make to support the VS Code side of things. But some comfort, I actually use NeoVim/Vim myself, so I'm sort of in that bracket. So I have a vested interest in getting things improved in the LSP, regardless of which editor. So just to give some comfort that there'll be a we will have a proper announcement of the working extension, VS Code extension, and QLSP. Some people have very generously been giving feedback already on things that are working and not working for them. But I actually want to make sure that we have a coherent thing to announce, rather than just allowing people to get stuck in the weeds of bugs, etc. Someone's also pointed out that we should publish the VS Code extension. Apologies if I'm not using the correct terminology here, but that same extension that is published to the VS Code marketplace to OpenVSX, we'll do that as well. And a critical thing will be that we have, using experience from GoPlease, a good means of people actually and quickly reporting bugs and issues for things that they run into, whether they be bugs in the evaluator or bugs in the LSP. Just a quick way to do that from VS Code will mean that we have higher quality reports. I'll skip over these other points here. Community updates, Dominic, I'll let you talk about that.
Yes, hello everyone. So this slide looks very similar to the slide that was presented last time, mainly due to the fact that it's still very much relevant. So if you are a user of Central Registry or modules, or if you think about using it, or if you want to learn more about it, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk to see how it fits with your specific use case. The same is true if you just have a general use case of Q. We learned already that there is such a wide spectrum on how people use Q. We love to learn about your individual use case. And yes, please reach out. Happy to talk. And also, if you want to put your logo on the qlang.org website, we have a few logos there, but we're always happy to add more. And lastly, we're still using Slack, but we also started a Discord server, mainly due to the advantage with Discord. We have a history, which is quite useful when we're referring or when users refer to previous discussions. The Discord server is also quite active nowadays, so please feel free to join. Regarding conferences, the next year is not that far away. We already decided that we're going to FOSDEM, Configuration Management Camp, and KubeCon London. There might be others, but if you already know you're there, let us know. We can meet, have a coffee, or a more lengthy meeting. Also, if you think there's a conference that would fit with what we're doing, please let us know. We're always interested to hear what's going on. Yes?
Great. Oh, Max, you'll be at Config Management Camp. KubeCon, great. We have the benefit of it being in London, KubeCon, which makes the trip slightly easier for those of us who are based in the UK, and a pleasant relief to having to travel too far. So look forward to welcoming those of you who are not UK-based to London for KubeCon if you're going to join us there. I should just briefly say on the Central Registry, thanks to a number of users who are long-term users of Q, actually, who have effectively challenged us in a really positive way on the module side of things with the Central Registry to say, oh, but hey, we're a company. and we already have our own OCI registry, what does the central registry mean for us? That's been incredibly useful, and actually part of the design of modules in the first place was very much intended to support that as a first-class use case. So if you are, I don't want to say like an enterprise user in some way, shape, or form, put simply, you have your own OCI server and you use that as the main sort of artifact store, please let us know. We're really happy to sort of chat about what ideas we have in that space and how the central registry will work effectively together with any such existing OCI server. And in particular, we're exploring deploying versions of the Q registry to sort of such users as like a front end to their existing OCI server, so that there's then very tight integration with the central registry. So please, that was just thanks to those users who engaged with us on that front. Otherwise, I think we're done in terms of slides. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to cover, we're actually finishing goodish time today. Happy to do so now. Alec, GreyMatter is gearing up to host our modules in our homegrown OCI registry. Brilliant, Alec, thanks. Yeah, not least because sort of understanding, so I'll read out what Alec's point is just in case, otherwise what I say next won't make much sense. Alec says, GreyMatter is gearing up to host our Q modules in our homegrown OCI registry. Would be more than happy to chat about that. That would be great. There's absolutely no sort of exclusivity on the central registry other than it being a well-known place that people will be publishing to. And so as a means of discovery, the central registry is one place, but there are other OCI registries that are available. And indeed, if people want to publish to other registries for whatever reason, it would be really good to understand the sort of the dynamics around that and how that would interplay with things like discoverability. So Alec, I'll absolutely take you up on that offer and set up some time with you. Otherwise, if we don't have any other follow-ups at this point, we will finish on time, which is absolutely a first. And thank everybody, wishing everybody a happy end to 2024 and a good start to 2025. And I suspect actually we'll look to have a community update earlier in the year rather than waiting for 2 months. So look forward to sharing more, especially around the 0.12 release. So look forward to sharing more then. Thanks everyone. And if you've got any follow-up, please let us know. Happy to chat offline and follow up afterwards with any other questions.